Looking for an easy hand sewing project? You might like to try this heart block. You just need a few supplies and minimum sewing skills to complete this project. Quick corners are used throughout, so you won't have to worry about cutting triangles or irregular shapes. Ready to begin? A link to the cutting and sewing directions for the 3-inch and 6-inch blocks can be found below. You'll need a needle and thread and a few fabric scraps for the heart in the background. I've cut out my pieces using a rotary cutter, but it's not necessary. I've included this sheet of templates for those of you who prefer using scissors to cut out those pieces. Draw a diagonal on the back of each one of your squares. Make sure to go from tip to tip when you draw this diagonal, or your quick corners will be off. I'm using a pen so you can see better, but you'll want to use a pencil or other marking instrument. Take one of the rectangles and a 1.5-inch square, put right sides together, and place it in the corner. Make sure the diagonal follows the same direction as the diagonal on your pattern. Line up these edges and pin. Today I'll be using black thread so you can see, but you'll want to use a more neutral color thread to do your patchwork. Thread your needle with a double strand that's about 1 foot long in length. Add a secure knot at the end. Start stitching on your line about 1/4 of an inch over from the edge. I like to come up from the back of my fabric. You might have to poke around a little till you get on that line and pull through. Before I start stitching down the line, I like to put in a back stitch. So I'll go back about 1/8 of an inch on that line and put a little stitch in. And then I'll come back up about where I started, and now I'm ready to sew. Try to keep your needle and thread on this side of the fabric, as it's easier to see that line. You can do that by pushing your needle down on the line and then feeling when it hits to the back with your finger and rocking that needle back a little to take a stitch. Let me do that again. Put my needle down on that line, I push through, I can feel it with my finger on the back. I'll rock this back a little, use my thumb to guide where that needle's going to go, and take a stitch. If this bothers your finger, you can always use a thimble for protection. Make your stitches about 1/8 of an inch apart. When you feel confident, you can load more than one stitch on. Make it go a little bit faster. Continue stitching in this manner till you get to the end. Just like when we started, you want to add a back stitch. So let me go down and then come back up, and I'm ready to knot this off. I usually like to put the knot on the back. Go back to the other side. I'll go into this stitch, make a loop, and then go into the middle of that loop for 1 knot, and I usually do 2 knots just to make sure. So there's my loop. I'll go into my loop and then clip my threads. Take the next square and put right sides together, making sure that this diagonal matches the diagonal on your pattern. Line up the edges and then pin in place. Start stitching about 1/4 of an inch from the edge. I like the knot on the back, so I'll come up through the top. Then I'll take a back stitch and come up right next to where I started. And I'm ready to stitch. Concentrate on making those stitches about 1/8 of an inch and stitch on the line. Use your thumb to help load those stitches. Continue stitching across the line. Always backstitch at the end to ensure those stitches stay in place, and then add your knots. I've pinned this last square in place, making sure that that diagonal goes in the same direction as the diagonal on the pattern. If you're having trouble making these smaller stitches, you can always stitch across with the larger stitches, and then when you come back, split those stitches in two. So let me show you what I mean. So here's that stitch, and I've split it in half, and now I'm going to go halfway between this stitch and go down, and I'll go halfway between this stitch and come up. This will hold the pieces together with stitches that are closer, and it will give you a chance to practice your stitching. When you get more confident, you can work on a single line of smaller stitches. Use this same process to make the other side of the heart. Place right sides together, making sure that the diagonal matches the direction of the diagonal on your pattern. Please note that this half is a mirror image of the other half. After you've sewn all the pieces, you're ready to press. I've pressed each one of these pieces back to the corner. I'll press this section a little bit different to allow for opposing seams. Instead of pulling this back and pressing to the corner, I'll turn this over, pull back this section, and press. Pull back this section and press. When everything's been pressed, this back side will look like this. When I turn it over, you can see where all those quick corners end up. Some folks like to leave this excess in, but I think it's too bulky for hand sewing. So I like to trim that out. I just eyeball about a 1/4 inch seam allowance and trim. To complete your heart, you'll sew a 1/4 inch seam down the center. Use a ruler to mark that seam on one of the hearts. Here's my 1/4 inch mark, and make sure that it's lined up, and then I'll draw in my line. You put right sides together, pin the two sections together, make sure that the edges line up and that the seams, that these opposing seams nestle in next to each other. Pin in place. You'll want to make sure that these edges also line up and that those opposing seams nestle in next to each other. I like to add a 3rd pin in the center here. Then stitch in place. Add some batting and backing to make a mug rug. Sew 3 blocks together for a table topper. Add more for a whole quilt. Try adding borders for another look. Use a smaller block for a special Valentine or to make an ornament to hang on a tree. Hope you decide to try hand sewing this block. If you're interested in more heart-themed blocks, check out our applique series. You'll learn a number of new techniques while making these blocks. Thanks for visiting LearnHowToQuilt.com. Please press the like button and share our videos with your friends.